Thank you very much, John, and thank you so much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to talk about this today. I really appreciate it, and thank you to everybody for coming along. I really appreciate the time this afternoon. Lovely to have this opportunity to talk about future data services and what it means in terms of provision of metadata over the next few years. I've been with ESRC now since December last year, so almost 1 year now, and it's amazing how much has happened in that time. In terms of what I do at ESRC, I'm head of data services infrastructure. We have a team in ESRC called Data and Infrastructure, and we're the team which fund the cohorts and studies. So, for example, Understanding Society is funding for Understanding Society comes through us, as does Election Studies, Centre for Longitudinal Studies, etc. My particular area of the team looks after funding for data services. So that includes UK Data Service, the Census Longitudinal Study, Research Support Units, and our current big data investments, such as Consumer Data Research Centre and Urban Big Data Centre. One of the things that's come about is the fact that we have a number of funded data services which have just about been extended to 2024. And what we want to think about is how ESRC and UKRI should continue to fund these services beyond 2024. And we want to think about what those data services should do, how should they support researchers, and how should they support data owners. And so we've put this programme of work together, which will take a 1.5 to 2 years, to help us think about the answer to those questions and gather the evidence that we need in order to answer those questions. And that's really what Future Data Services is about. And I think it's what I wanted to do is just first of all share with you some of the thoughts that I've got about the current data services landscape, because it's quite a busy landscape. There's an awful lot going on. There are lots of initiatives happening, lots of existing services being managed, and there's a lot of expertise. But when I started thinking about what future data services could be designed to achieve, I reflected on the fact about how busy this landscape is. And there are a lot of different data services around. They'll have been set up for different reasons with different funding over different periods of time. They aren't always coordinated, and the ESRC hasn't always asked them to coordinate with each other. And as a result of that, there are times where we do see some duplication between what one service does and another service does. And so obviously in the future, we want to avoid that happening. We're starting to find there's this sort of asymmetric information problem coming about, whereby researchers don't necessarily know where they're meant to be going to access data. And the people who create data, and data owners, data suppliers, aren't always sure where they're meant to be depositing data either. So that's something that we need to consider as well. And to date, ESRC has generally funded each of these data services separately in a siloed type of approach. And so now we're sort of thinking about how those data services complement each other and how they could work together in the future. So I would characterize the data landscape as being fairly busy. And we also know there are new demands from researchers all the time. Research itself is becoming much more interdisciplinary. It's also becoming much more of a cross-sector activity. It's certainly not unusual to see researchers who are perhaps commissioned by government agencies, working with charities, and researchers aren't just restricted to the academic sector. There are plenty of researchers in the private sector and industry as well, doing similar kind of research, just in a slightly different way. And it's often the case that the nature and pace of research has perhaps changed from that traditional academic model, particularly where research is commissioned by government agencies. It's not uncommon to hear from researchers that they've asked been to deliver research in 3 to 6 weeks, and the demands that places on our current data services can't be underestimated, and it can cause problems. We're aware of this, so those new demands are something else we need to consider. But of course, the world is very different, since many of these data services were first established in 2012 and those early 2010s. We have UK Data Service that was first funded in 2012. The consumer and urban big data centres were established in 2014, when big data was still a term widely used to describe very large data sets, and the world has changed since then. And for example, there are new technologies that exist, and we want to think about how researchers can benefit from those new technologies, and how data services can benefit from those new technologies. And there are also new legal frameworks as well. So for example, the GDPR came into effect in 2018. That is now being looked at again for potential revision following Brexit, and there are new legal frameworks, other new legal frameworks in place, such as the Digital Economy Act, which came in 2017, I think. So that legal and technological landscape does look a bit different now to when some of our existing data services were first funded. What's really, really important is that we should acknowledge the skills and expertise that exists in the landscape, and that's why I'm so thrilled to be able to present today, because many of the folk that have joined this call are experts in their field, and it's really important that ESRC speaks to folks such as yourselves, because we know you have an audience that can help us answer some of the questions around what comes after 2024. So the aim of Future Data Services is to think about how data services should be structured and funded beyond 2024. First part of this really is working out what we need. What do we, the funders, need? What do data owners need? What does the research community need? And what do the existing data service community need themselves? Something for ESRC to do, possibly as a research council in its own right, or through more widely through UKRI, is to establish funding for these data services to be used beyond 2024. We're probably going to be looking at not the coming spending review cycle, but for one after that. And we also have to think about how these data services are going to be delivered in the future. And our rough timescale for doing this work is represented here. We want to spend the rest of this year and almost all of next year undertaking a landscape mapping exercise where we identify who's doing what activity across the landscape. And we want to talk to as many stakeholders as we possibly can, engaging them through workshops and meetings such as this. And those stakeholders are going to be really varied. That they would include folk such as yourselves, but we also want to speak to researchers, and we want to speak to other data services, and we like to speak to data owners too. That landscape mapping and stakeholder engagement, we think, should give us the evidence we need to be able to develop a set of options for future funding. And those options, we'll then spend a bit of time appraising those and peer reviewing those options. The aim is then that we will be able to put a call out in early to mid 2023. That's a call for a new set of data services beyond 2024. And so the commissioning of those data services will begin around halfway or towards the end of 2024. So that's a very rough timescale. And I think in terms of thinking about some of the characteristics I mentioned in the landscape before, what we really want to think about is the fact that we do have so many components of this data landscape, and we really want to make sure that in the future they are enhanced and updated as they need to be, but also that they really interconnect with each other and work together well. And it's really fortunate that now that ESRC is part of a wider UKRI family of research councils, and we have what we call a digital research infrastructure programme of work being undertaken, but we do in ESRC have the opportunity to tap into what other research councils can offer. So for example, I've been able to speak to colleagues and potentially work with them on things like bringing high performance computing, the kind of facilities which the EPSRC funds to the social science world, thinking about how we could work with MRC on different initiatives, thinking about how we could work with AHRC on some of these initiatives too. And just sort of recognising that social science doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course, we know that it doesn't. We now have that opportunity to work with other councils and to bring some of those resources into play as well. So one key aim is to channel that energy and those resources from those other councils into this programme. The second kind of aim is to really make sure that we have excellent collaboration between people within the landscape, just sort of recognising that collaboration is a really good aim to achieve. And we already see some excellent examples of that, and I'm particularly thinking of the work that John with Closer and Darren at the UK Data Service have been doing on metadata. That's a really nice example where two investments, as we call them, come together and work together to solve a particular problem, and we want to encourage more of that in the future. The other aim is to make sure that for a researcher and a data owner connecting into this network of data services is really seamless, and that connection happens instantly and thoughtlessly. And that's going to be particularly important in the future, as there are more of these components around, but there are more challenges that have to be addressed. And we really want to make sure we have a network which is, at all levels are talking and working together. In terms of getting there, I think I've sort of mentioned this before, really, but we've got these sort of 4 stages of undertaking a landscape mapping exercise. We want to think about what exists now and what should exist in the future, and that's really where I'd invite this audience to help answer those questions. There'll be a number of stakeholder engagement activities that we undertake with researchers and data owners, our existing data service investments. We know the government are really keen on knowing more about this. There are various strategies which the government have published over the last few months which point to a more comprehensive and enhanced digital research infrastructure. And obviously we're working with folk in the third sector as well as in academia too. We want to gather requirements, working out what's needed, testing those requirements, undertaking a robust review of what's being proposed, so that we can have a really good, strong options development and appraisal. And then we can develop a really good call for future data services beyond 2024. In terms of landscape work itself, there's sort of 5 mapping areas that we thought we could consider here, and 5 seems to be a good manageable number to work with. In no particular order, and this diagram certainly doesn't follow the data life cycle, so please don't hold me up on that one. But just thinking about from left to right first, an area is around discovery, data management and curation. And I think that would include metadata management as well. So we want to make sure that researchers can find data easily and quickly. We want to make sure that those metadata systems are fit for purpose. And we're not really thinking about what's fit for purpose now, but we're thinking fit for purpose in terms of 2024 to 2030. So we're sort of thinking, fairly large time horizons in mind. There's a second piece of work around technology. So thinking about how should trusted research environments operate in the future, what kind of tools and facilities will they need to serve the research community after 2024? How about the role of software and the role of high performance computing? And those are just 3 areas of that kind of tech work stream that we have in mind to look at. Data access support and training are going to continue to be really important. We really want to make sure data access is as efficient as possible. This is probably less of a technical area than some of the others, but perhaps technology can play a part. And what training will researchers need in the future, and what training can data services offer? Something I'm particularly interested in is the people strand of this work. So this is thinking about not for researchers themselves, but essentially the staff working in these data services, and thinking about the opportunities they have to enrich their careers, develop and learn themselves, and gain new experiences in order to be able to support data services in the future. UKRI does run a programme called the Technicians Commitment. That's traditionally been geared towards lab technicians really working for the physical sciences, but we have a whole range of people working in data services with various job titles, data scientists, data engineers, data architects, user support officers, data managers, etc. And I've always wondered where are those career progression paths for them, and how can they be supported to enable them to then support researchers. So that's something we'd like to develop too. And there's a final area of work thinking about legal issues. I mentioned work beginning to start on thinking about how GDPR will be, or data protection legislation will be revised in the UK. Ethics, how researchers and how people can use data, public expectations of using data, etc. And of course, we've also got to think about the impact of our investments and the impact which those data services are making. And so that's a 5th theme. And so that's what we intend to work on over the next year and a half. So in terms of our ask to you, we want people to be ambitious and bold and brave and sharp, and really think about ideas that they have and approach us with those ideas. And we want to sort of know what needs to be changed and what should stay the same as well. That's also important. There's some really good work that's been undertaken, and this project is not about undoing all of that good work. but it's about thinking how we can build on that good work, and think about what frustrations there might be that we can resolve together in the future. So I guess in terms of metadata, this is really the first opportunity I've had to talk to a community like this and ask some questions. And the ones I thought of when I was putting these slides together were around the metadata management systems that we'll need in the future. I don't know really I'm not a metadata expert, so I don't really know what we have at the moment, apart from I know of a handful of metadata standards. But what metadata management systems will we need in the future? What frustrations do you as metadata professionals have right now? What would you like to see changed? And what do researchers and data owners want from metadata? Are their needs being met at the moment? If they are, that's fantastic, but what if their needs change in the future? And what about the changing nature of data? Do we have metadata systems which can capture all types of data, or are there still some types of data for which current metadata systems aren't really working for right now? And then what are the opportunities to collaborate, both now and in the future? What ideas do people have that they'd like to work on, either within an existing data service or across data services? It'd be great to hear about some of those ideas. So in terms of getting involved with this work, as I said, we at ESRC really want to hear from you. This is a really important area of work. It's one for which there is a large amount of expertise and knowledge that's been built up over the last, I don't know how long. Speaking as someone working in this field for 14 years, I've always been quite amazed about how much knowledge there is in this field. And we just want to capitalise on that, and we'd really like it if people would like to work with us. We're also going to be setting up some expert groups to think about this too. So again, if people would like to be involved, here's my email address and you're welcome to get in touch with me. I think Jenny is also going to give you an opportunity to sign up after this presentation. So again, thank you, John, for the time to talk about this just now. That's really the end of my presentation. And perhaps we open up to floor for ideas and suggestions and questions, please.